Snow fell through open wooden slats of the great hall, melting instantly against heated stone. A king sat on a carved oak throne, his thick fingers tangled in the braided hair of a woman who was not his true mate. Across the room, a different woman stood perfectly still in the shadows. No one spoke as the soul-bound mark on her pale skin began to wither. It flaked away like old parchment, turning dull grey. A sacred bond broken not by dark magic, but by simple, quiet indifference. The bond didn't die with a theatrical snap or a burst of divine agony. It died the way a fire does when you stop feeding it, slowly, pitifully, and with a terrible amount of smoke that stung the eyes. I stood by the tapestry of the first hunt, my back pressed against the draughty stone wall of the keep. The wool of my dress was heavy, scratching at my collarbone, but it was nothing compared to the persistent, grating itch on the left side of my neck. Where Kaelin had bitten me 3 months ago, where the goddess was supposed to have stitched our souls together with golden thread, or whatever nonsense the clerics peddled to the pups. In reality, the mark felt like a bad burn that refused to heal, and tonight it was peeling. I dug my fingernail into the edge of the blackened scar, flicking away a piece of dead, silvery skin. It fell to the rush-covered floor, lost among the dropped mutton fat and dog hair. At the high table, Kaelin was laughing. The sound rumbled through the cavernous hall, bouncing off the soot-stained rafters. He was a massive man, built like a siege engine, with a thick beard and eyes the colour of bruised iron. Beside him sat Beatrice. She wasn't an evil seductress. I almost wished she were. It would make hating her easier. Beatrice was just soft. She smelled of crushed lavender and expensive sweet almond oil, a stark contrast to the omnipresent odour of wet wool, wood smoke, and sweat that clung to the rest of the pack. She had a gentle, high-pitched laugh and hands that had never butchered a deer or scrubbed blood from a tunic. She leaned into Kaelin, her delicate fingers resting on his forearm. He didn't pull away. He leaned down, pressing his face into her neck, right where a mate mark should be. A phantom ache flared in my chest, dull and heavy, like a swallowed stone. But it was weaker than it had been a week ago. That was the most cynical part of it all. The legend said a rejected mate would wither away and die of heartbreak, vomiting blood and howling at the moon. The truth was far more mundane. I was just tired. My lower back ached from standing, my feet were freezing in my leather boots, and I desperately wanted a cup of hot, spiced wine, but the serving girls were avoiding my side of the hall. To them, I was a walking corpse, the fated mate who failed to keep her alpha. You shouldn't stand in the shadows, Maeve. It makes you look like a ghost. I didn't turn. Auric, Kaelin's beta, and a man with too many scars and not enough tact, stopped beside me. He held 2 heavy clay mugs, the steam rising in curling wisps. He shoved one into my hands. The heat seeped through the thick pottery, burning my freezing palms in a way that felt incredibly grounding. I am a ghost, Auric, I said, taking a sip. It was bitter, heavy on the cloves. Or I will be, once this scab falls off completely. Auric frowned, his gaze tracking over to the high table. Kaelin was feeding Beatrice a piece of roasted apple from his own knife. He's a fool. The winter is going to be brutal. The western packs are testing our borders, and he's thinking with his cock instead of his wolf. Don't insult the Alpha King, I murmured, staring at my reflection in the dark surface of the wine. It's treason. It's the truth. You're his fated. The pack magic is tied to the pair of you. Auric looked at my neck, his expression tightening with a mixture of pity and disgust. How much longer? A few days. Maybe a week. I brought a hand up, my fingertips brushing the raised, inflamed edges of the bite. It stopped burning. Now it just feels hollow. Maeve, don't. I cut him off, my voice dropping to a flat, hard whisper. Do not pity me. I don't want it. I just want to know when I can leave this damp, miserable keep. You know you can't leave, Oryx said heavily. He won't allow it. It would look bad for morale if his true mate abandoned the territory. I let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. Morale? He's parading a perfumed noblewoman in the seat meant for the Luna. He doesn't care about morale. He cares about comfort. I am a reminder of a duty he didn't ask for. He just wants me out of sight. As if hearing my words, Kalen looked up from the high table. Across the smoky, crowded hall, his iron eyes locked onto mine. There was a time, right after the claiming, when a look from him would send a jolt of raw, electric heat straight to my core. Now, looking at him, just gave me a headache. He narrowed his eyes. The wolf inside him, the beast that recognized my scent, even if the man denied it, pushed forward. I saw the subtle shift in his posture, the stiffening of his spine, the way his nostrils flared to catch my scent over the roasting meats and stale ale. I didn't look away. I didn't cower, and I didn't weep. I simply raised my mug in a mock, microscopic toast, took another swallow of bitter wine, and turned my back on the Alpha King. The corridors of the eastern wing were freezing. The hearths here hadn't been lit in days, a subtle slight by the domestic staff who knew I no longer held any real authority. I didn't care. The cold felt good against the feverish itch of my fading mark. I was walking back to my chambers, a small, draughty room far from the royal suite, when heavy, hurried footsteps echoed against the stone behind me. Maeve, his voice was a deep baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. I stopped, my shoulders tensing, but I forced my muscles to relax before turning around. Kalen stood a few paces away. Up close, the sheer size of him was suffocating. He wore a tunic of dark spun wool, his fur-lined mantle thrown casually over one shoulder. He smelled of pine, male sweat, roasted meat, and underneath it all, the sickeningly sweet scent of Beatrice's lavender oil. It made my stomach churn. My king, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of inflection. I didn't bow. Fated mates didn't bow to each other, even rejected ones. He closed the distance between us, his boots loud in the quiet corridor. His jaw was tight, the muscles jumping beneath his thick beard. He looked tired. There were dark bruises under his eyes, a physical manifestation of the broken bond tearing at his own soul. He might be ignoring the magic, but his wolf was punishing him for it. Don't do that, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Do what? Look at me like I'm a stranger. Act like a ghost in my hall. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around my upper arm. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. A jolt of static electricity snapped between our skin. My breath hitched, a purely physiological reaction, but I forced myself to stare blankly at his chest rather than meet his eyes. I am a stranger, Kalen, and you made me a ghost. He let out a frustrated breath, dropping my arm as if I had burned him. You know how it is, Maeve. The bond, it's a relic, an outdated piece of goddess magic that forces two strangers together to breed. I am a king. I need a queen who understands the courts, who can navigate the southern alliances. Beatrice comes from a family of wealth and influence. Beatrice comes from a family that pays her way into a warm bed, I replied dryly. And you like that she doesn't challenge you when you make poor tactical decisions. She smiles and pours your wine. She brings peace to this pack, he snapped, his eyes flashing a momentary, terrifying gold. She brings perfume and soft hands, I countered, my voice remarkably steady. I looked up at him, studying the handsome, rugged face that fate had mistakenly assigned to me. I don't care, Kaelin. Do you understand that? I am too exhausted to care who warms your furs. But don't stand in a freezing corridor and insult my intelligence by dressing up your preference as political strategy. He stared at me, his chest heaving slightly. For a moment, the Alpha King looked completely lost. The wolf in him was screaming to pin me to the wall, to claim what was his, to rub his scent over me, until the lavender was entirely drowned out by rain and earth. I could see the battle in the twitch of his fingers. "You will be provided for," he said finally, his voice stiff and formal, a rehearsed speech. "You will have a permanent place in the keep, a stipend, guards. You will live comfortably, Maeve. No one will disrespect you." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It echoed off the stone, sounding entirely hollow. "No one will disrespect me?" "Kaelin, the scullery maids spit in my washwater. The guards pretend not to hear me when I ask for firewood. You have stripped me of my mate, my title, and my purpose. Comfort is a myth you tell yourself so you can sleep at night." I stepped closer to him. He didn't move back, but I saw his pupils dilate. "You chose her," I whispered, looking up into his bruised iron eyes. "Live with it. But do not expect me to be your pet, kept in a cage in the East Wing, just to soothe your guilty conscience." I turned and walked away. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, leaving a metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. I expected him to roar, to command me to stop with the alpha tone that forced lesser wolves to their knees. He didn't. He just stood there in the cold, smelling of pine and lavender, watching me walk away. And as I turned the corner, my hand flew to my neck. The mark was burning again, a sharp, searing pain. Another layer of the bond dying. By the 4th day of the deep freeze, the keep was snowed in. The pack was restless, trapped indoors with nothing but ale, idle gossip, and the mounting tension of a broken mate bond poisoning the air. I was in the lower armory. The smell down here was sharp, linseed oil, rust, and damp earth. I sat on a wooden stool, methodically polishing a rusted broadsword with a piece of rough linen and crushed sand. It was mindless work, servant's work. It kept my hands busy and my mind blank. My neck didn't itch anymore. It didn't burn. It just felt cold. Heavy footsteps descended the stone stairs. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sheer pressure in the air, the suffocating aura of an alpha, announced Kaelin long before his boots hit the dirt floor of the armory. He walked slowly, stepping past racks of spears and dull training swords. He looked worse than he had in the corridor. He was pale, a fine sheen of sweat coating his forehead, despite the chill in the cellar. His wolf was tearing him apart from the inside, desperate for the tether he was actively severing. "They said I would find you down here," he rasped. He stopped a few feet away, leaning heavily against a wooden support pillar. "Swords need oiling," I said simply, not breaking my rhythm. "Scrape, rub, polish." "Why are you doing servant's work, Maeve?" "Because I am not the queen," I replied, applying more pressure to a stubborn patch of rust. "And I refuse to sit in a room staring at the wall until I rot." Kaelin ran a hand over his face. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a split second I saw a flash of raw, unfiltered panic in his eyes. "It hurts," he admitted, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. The confession seemed to be ripped from his throat against his will. I stopped polishing. I laid the sword across my lap, my hand stained dark with oil and grime, and looked at the great Alpha King. "It's supposed to," I said, devoid of sympathy. "You are starving your wolf. You are defying the goddess." "I am defying a system that treats us like livestock," he snarled, pushing off the pillar. He paced toward me, the air crackling with his agitated energy. "I am the king. I choose my fate. I choose who stands beside me." "Then why are you down in a damp cellar, complaining to me about the pain?" I asked, my voice cutting through his bravado like a freshly whetted blade. He stopped, standing directly over me. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and grabbed my chin. His fingers were rough, calloused, and freezing. He tilted my head to the side, forcing my neck into the dim light of the single torch burning on the wall. He stared at the mark. For 3 months, it had been a vibrant, angry red, a crescent moon intersected by a jagged line, a symbol of 2 souls bound in blood and magic. Now it was completely grey. The skin was dry, brittle, like a leaf in late autumn. As Kalen stared, his thumb brushed against the edge of the mark. He didn't mean to do it. It was a subconscious gesture, a last, desperate attempt by his wolf to soothe the dying bond. His rough thumb caught the edge of the grey, dead skin. It didn't hurt. I felt absolutely nothing as the final scab of the mate mark peeled away, adhering to Kalen's thumb for a second before drifting down to the dirt floor. Beneath it, the skin was smooth, pale, unblemished. The silence in the armory was absolute. Not even the sound of the wind outside penetrated the thick stone walls. I watched Kalen's face. I watched the exact moment the bond snapped completely. It hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, a sharp, choked gasp escaping his lips. His hands flew to his chest as if he had been shot with an arrow. The void left by the severed connection was instantaneous and absolute. A piece of his soul had just been cleanly amputated. He fell to his knees, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were wide, staring at the empty space on my neck where his claim used to be. I sat on the stool, holding the half-polished sword. I waited for the agony to hit me. I waited for the heartbreak, for the tears, for the legendary sorrow of the rejected mate. But as I looked at the Alpha King, kneeling in the dirt, gasping for air as he finally realized the permanence of his choice, I felt nothing. Just an empty, cold relief. The heavy chain around my neck was gone. I stood up, the sword clattering onto the workbench. I grabbed a rag, wiping the dark oil from my hands. "You chose her, Kalen," I said, my voice echoing softly in the cavernous room. "And now, I am completely mine again." I didn't look back as I walked up the stairs, leaving the Alpha King choking on the ashes of his own fire. Waking up the next morning felt like stepping off a ship that had been rolling in a storm for months. There was a profound, disorienting stillness in my chest. For 90 days, I had lived with a constant, low-grade static buzzing at the base of my skull, the one-way pull of a mate bond, trying to anchor itself to a man who kept batting it away. I was so used to the noise that its sudden absence was deafening. I lay in the dark, staring at the frost creeping across the single pane of glass in my chamber, and waited for the ache. It didn't come. I touched my neck. The skin was smooth, cold. The phantom burn was gone, leaving behind nothing but the mundane chill of a drafty keep in deep winter. I pushed back the heavy furs. The air in the room was biting, raising goosebumps on my arms. I dressed slowly, pulling on 2 layers of undyed wool and a worn leather bodice that smelled of saddle soap. I didn't bother with the fine silken undertunics Kalen had gifted me during the brief, confusing week after the claiming. I shoved them to the bottom of my cedar chest. They smelled faintly of mothballs and a life that was never going to happen. When I entered the great hall, the shift in the pack was palpable. It wasn't a dramatic uproar. It was the absolute, suffocating tension of a drawn bowstring. Wolves are deeply territorial, sensitive creatures. They navigate the world through scent, hierarchy, and the unseen web of pack magic. The Alpha is the sun in our solar system. His strength dictates the gravity that keeps everyone from floating off into the dark. And today, the gravity was completely skewed. The high table was half empty. Kalen was absent. In his place, sitting squarely in the Alpha's massive, fur-draped chair, was Beatrice. She looked immaculate, as always. Her velvet gown was a deep, rich plum that contrasted beautifully with her pale skin. Her golden hair was pinned up in an intricate web of braids, but she looked incredibly small. The chair swallowed her. Worse, she was vibrating with a nervous energy she was desperately trying to hide. The hall was too quiet. The clatter of wooden spoons against trenchers was muted. The usual boisterous arguments over hunting territories were reduced to low, harsh whispers. Every wolf in the room could smell it, the sour, sharp tang of a severed bond. It leaked from Kalen's empty chair, seeping into the stone, poisoning the breakfast spread. I walked to the lower tables. The serving girls, who usually avoided my gaze, stared openly. A young maid named Nessa dropped a loaf of bread when she saw me. She didn't apologize. She just scrambled away, her eyes wide. They could smell the change on me, too. I no longer smelled of their Alpha. I smelled like rain, old leather, and absolutely nothing else. I was a blank slate. I sat at the end of a bench, wedging myself between two grizzled border patrollers. They shifted uncomfortably but didn't tell me to leave. I grabbed a wooden bowl and served myself a ladle of oat porridge. It was grey, gritty, and lukewarm. I ate it mechanically, enjoying the bland, starchy texture against my tongue. "Maeve." The voice was high and musical. It grated against the grim silence of the hall like a silver spoon scraping a tin plate. I didn't stop eating. I chewed, swallowed, and slowly looked up. Beatrice stood opposite the long table. Two heavily armed guards flanked her, though their body language screamed discomfort. They were pack wolves. They were guarding her because Kalen had ordered it, not because their instincts demanded it. "Good morning, Lady Beatrice," I said, my voice flat. She offered a smile that trembled at the edges. Up close, the heavy scent of her lavender oil was cloying, masking the smell of her own human fear. I was hoping we could speak, privately. "There are no secrets in a wolf keep," I replied, dragging my wooden spoon through the thick porridge. "If you have something to say, say it. The hall is listening anyway." A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. Several wolves paused with their mugs halfway to their mouths, their eyes locked on us. Beatrice's smile tightened. She didn't like this. She was accustomed to the polite, venomous whispers of southern courts, not the blunt, aggressive stare of 40 hungry carnivores. "Kalen is unwell this morning." "The winter fever is going around," I said smoothly. "It isn't a fever." She stepped closer, her hands clasping in front of her plum velvet skirt. Her knuckles were white. "He won't let me in the room. He smashed a wash basin against the door. He's acting like a wild animal." "He is a wild animal, Beatrice. That's what you bought into when your father brokered this arrangement." I finally set my spoon down and met her gaze. "Did you think the Alpha of the Northern Ridge was just a large man with a bad temper?" "He loves me," she whispered, a desperate, defensive edge creeping into her tone. She needed the room to hear it. "He chose me." "He did," I agreed easily. I felt no sting in the words. It was simply a fact, like the snow outside. "He chose you. He broke a sacred bond for you. So, go soothe your king. Sing him a song. Rub that expensive oil on his temples." "He won't look at me." Her voice cracked, soaring an octave too high. "He's pacing. He's growling at the shadows. Oryx says it's because of you, that you did something to him in the armory." I let out a short, harsh breath, a cynical laugh trapped in my chest. "I didn't do anything, Beatrice. I just let him go. When you sever a limb, the body bleeds. Kalen amputated his own soul yesterday. If he is bleeding out, That is his mess to clean up, and yours to manage. I stood up, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. The two guards tensed, their hands hovering near their sword hilts. I ignored them. I was smaller than them, but I was born to the ice and the pines. They knew I could rip a throat out before they cleared their scabbards, even without the Alpha's protection. "You wanted the crown," I said, leaning over the wooden table, bringing my face inches from hers. I lowered my voice, letting the sheer, icy emptiness inside me bleed into my words. "You have it. The keep, the title, the man. But do not ever come to me to fix the beast he becomes when he realizes what he threw away." I turned my back on her and walked out of the hall. The silence that followed me was heavier than the snow piling against the gates. The courtyard was a blinding expanse of white. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron. The cold was brutal, the kind that immediately crystallized the moisture in your nose and made your lungs ache with every drawn breath. I stood by the blacksmith's forge, seeking the residual heat of the banked coals. I was watching the stable hands trying to break the ice in the horse troughs with heavy iron bars. The rhythmic thwack-crack was almost hypnotic. I was trying to decide what to pack. A horse was out of the question. The drifts were too high, and the pack would consider taking a mount as theft. I would have to walk to the southern outpost, 3 days on foot in a frozen wasteland. It was suicide for a human, but a wolf could make it. If I shifted, my fur would keep me warm. The problem was food. "You're calculating rations." I didn't flinch. Auric always walked like a ghost, despite his heavy frame. He stopped beside me, the heat radiating from his massive body, cutting through the courtyard's chill. He smelled of wet dog, oxidized iron, and deep, simmering anxiety. "Hardtack and dried venison," I murmured, watching a shard of ice fly from the trough. "I think I can carry enough for 4 days, just in case the snow slows me down." "You can't leave, Maeve." "Watch me," Auric sighed, a heavy, rattling sound in his chest. He turned to face me, his scarred face looking 10 years older than it had the night before. The deep gouge across his left eye, a gift from a rogue bear, twitched slightly. "The western packs are mobilizing," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for my ears. "Our scouts reported fresh tracks along the Red River. They know something is wrong. They can smell the weakness. Then reinforce the borders," I said indifferently. "Double the patrols. You're the beta. Do your job." "My job is to support the Alpha, but I can't support a man who is currently trying to claw his way through the stone floor of his bedchamber." Auric stepped closer, blocking the biting wind. "He is losing his mind, Maeve. The wolf is taking over. It's looking for its mate, and it can't understand why the tether is gone. It's gone because he severed it," I snapped, a sudden spike of irritation breaking through my cold detachment. He made a choice. The human man decided he wanted a soft, pretty thing that didn't challenge him. The wolf is just paying the price. I am not the pack's medicine. "I am not asking you to heal him," Auric said, his voice dropping to a harsh, pleading register. "I am asking you to stabilize him. Just for a few days. Walk into that room. Let his beast see that you are alive, that you haven't been killed. It might be enough to calm the panic. If he doesn't pull himself together by nightfall, the elders will challenge his right to rule. And if Kaelin falls, this keep will drown in blood." I stared at the glowing embers in the forge. The heat was searing my cheek, while the other side of my face was completely numb from the wind. It was a perfect, physical representation of the contradiction tearing at me. I hated Kaelin. I hated the humiliation. I hated the months of standing in the shadows while he paraded Beatrice around. I owed him nothing but a knife in the ribs. But Auric was right about the keep. The people here, the gruff border guards, the terrified scullery maids, the pups playing in the lower courtyards, They didn't choose Beatrice. They were just surviving under the Alpha's umbrella. If a Western pack breached the walls, it would be a massacre. "One visit," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I walk in. He sees me. I walk out. Then I pack my bags, and you ensure the gate guards look the other way when I leave. Auric closed his eyes, relief washing over his battered features. "You have my word." The Alpha's suite was at the highest point of the keep, accessible only by a winding stone staircase. As we climbed, the smell grew stronger. It wasn't the scent of a king. It was the scent of a trapped animal. Sour sweat, dark musk, and the sharp metallic tang of pure, unadulterated panic. 2 guards stood outside the heavy oak door. They looked terrified. One of them had a bloody scratch across his cheek. Auric nodded to them. "Open it!" The guard hesitated, his hand shaking as he pulled the heavy iron bolt back. The door swung open with a groan. I stepped inside. The room was a disaster. The heavy velvet curtains had been ripped from their rods, pooling on the floor in tangled heaps. The wash basin was shattered, water and jagged porcelain scattered across the woven rugs. A heavy oak chair had been splintered against the far wall. In the center of the wreckage stood Calen. He was bare-chested, barefoot, and shivering violently despite the massive fire roaring in the hearth. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. His eyes were entirely gold, the mark of a wolf in complete control. The human Calen was buried deep, suffocating beneath the weight of his beast's agony. He whipped his head toward the door as I entered. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest. It was a sound that shook the dust from the rafters. It wasn't a threat. It was a desperate, agonizing plea. He dropped to his hands and knees, ignoring the shards of porcelain cutting into his skin. He crawled towards me. Behind me, I heard Auric draw his sword, just an inch. A precaution. I held up a hand, stopping the beta. I didn't move. I stood perfectly still, letting my scent wash over the room. Rain and old leather. Calen stopped a few feet away. He lifted his head, his golden eyes frantically searching my face. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. He was searching for the bond. He was looking for the golden thread of magic, the magnetic pull that told him mine. Safe. Home. He found nothing. The realization hit the beast just as it had hit the man in the armory. A heartbreaking whine broke through his chest. He reached a trembling hand out, his bloodied fingers hovering inches from my boots. He didn't dare touch me. The wolf knew he had lost the right. "I am alive," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of anger or warmth. Just a statement of fact. "I am unharmed. You are not mourning a death." Calen squeezed his eyes shut. A single, violent shudder racked his massive frame. When he opened his eyes again, the gold was receding, bleeding back into bruised iron. The human was surfacing, pulled back from the brink of feral madness by the sheer, cold reality of my presence. He looked at his bleeding hands, then at the wrecked room, and finally up at me. The devastation in his face was absolute. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a dream of flying, only to realize he had stepped off a cliff. "Maeve," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "Get off the floor, Calen," I said softly. "Your pack needs a king. Wash your hands, put on a shirt, and do not ever summon me again." I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the door wide open. I didn't wait for Auric. I didn't need to. The debt was paid, the beast was contained, and I was completely, undeniably done. Packing took less than 10 minutes. My life in the keep had been temporary, a holding pattern while I waited for a bond to cement that never did. I rolled 3 heavy wool tunics, a spare pair of thick woolen hose, and a flint striker into my waxed canvas cloak. I tied the bundle with a length of rough hemp rope and slung it across my back. I slid my hunting knife into the sheath at my thigh. It was perfectly balanced, the hilt worn smooth by my own grip. I took nothing Kaelin had given me. Not the dresses, not the silver combs, not the fur-lined boots. I left wearing the clothes I had arrived in 3 months ago. The descent through the keep was quiet. The afternoon sun had dipped behind the western peaks, casting the stone corridors in deep, bruising shadows. I met no resistance. Auric had kept his word. The few servants I passed kept their eyes on the floor, stepping aside to let me pass. I walked out into the courtyard. The wind had picked up, howling through the battlements, lifting plumes of white snow into the air like dancing ghosts. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against my face, trying to push me back inside. I leaned into it. The heavy iron gates of the keep were closed. 2 sentries stood in the gatehouse, wrapped in thick furs, stamping their feet to keep the blood flowing. "Open the gate," I called out over the wind. They hesitated, exchanging a nervous glance. They had their orders from Auric, but breaking 100 years of pack law by letting a fated mate leave the territory was not a decision guards made lightly. "Open it," I repeated, letting a fraction of my own dominance seep into the command. I wasn't an alpha, but I was a high-born wolf, and I was out of patience. One of the guards reached for the winch mechanism. "Stop!" The word wasn't shouted, but it cut through the howling wind with devastating clarity. The guard froze, pulling his hand back from the iron wheel as if it had burned him. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the freezing air. I didn't want this. I wanted a clean break. I wanted to fade into the snow. I turned around. Kaelin stood at the base of the keep's main steps. He was dressed now. He wore a heavy leather tunic and a thick fur mantle, but he still looked hollowed out. The feverish frenzy of the beast was gone, replaced by a bleak, crushing desperation. Beatrice was nowhere in sight. He walked slowly across the snow-packed courtyard. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face. He stopped 10 paces from me, putting himself directly between me and the gate. "Where are you going?" he asked. His voice was steady, but I could hear the immense effort it took to keep it that way. "South," I answered simply. "To the neutral territories, or maybe east to the coast. It doesn't matter. You will freeze to death before you reach the tree line. I have survived worse." I looked pointedly at his chest. "I survived you." He flinched, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the brief closing of his eyes. "Maeve, be reasonable. The bond is broken. I accept that. The consequences are mine to bear. But you don't have to walk into a blizzard. I promised you comfort. A place here." "A cage," I corrected. "A warm cage where you can visit me when the guilt gets too heavy. Where you can assure yourself that you aren't a monster because you kept the pet alive." "I am trying to protect you," he roared, the sudden spike of anger, a fleeting remnant of the arrogant king he used to be. "I don't need your protection," I shouted back, the sound tearing from my throat. "I needed a mate. I needed the man the goddess promised me. But you threw that away for a woman who smells like perfume and bows her head when you speak." The courtyard was dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kaelin stared at me, his chest heaving. "I am the Alpha," he said, his voice dropping to that deep, rumbling frequency that vibrated in the bones of every wolf in the territory. The Alpha tone. The absolute command that demanded submission. "You will not leave this keep." The sound washed over me. I felt the physical pressure of it, a heavy wave of dominance, meant to force me to my knees, meant to make my neck bare and my eyes drop. It hit me, and it shattered like fragile glass against a stone wall. I didn't kneel. I didn't avert my gaze. I stood perfectly straight, my hands resting loosely at my sides. The command meant nothing. The magic behind it was tied to the pack, to the bond, to the intricate web of loyalty and submission that held us together. By breaking our bond, he had severed my tie to the pack. I was a rogue now. His magic had no hold on me. The realization hit Kalen a second later. He saw it in my eyes, the complete, utter lack of submission, the total absence of his influence. His face crumbled. The arrogant alpha vanished, leaving behind a broken, exhausted man standing in the snow. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out, not to command, but to beg. "Please," he whispered. The word was a jagged, ugly thing. "Maeve, please." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the heroic pleading of a man realizing his true love. It was the pathetic grasp of a man who realized he had set his own house on fire and was begging the smoke not to leave. I looked at him. I memorized the dark circles under his eyes, the defeat in his posture, the way his hand trembled in the freezing air. "Goodbye, Kalen," I said. I didn't wait for his permission. I turned my back to the Alpha King and looked up at the sentries. "Open the gate." The winch groaned, the heavy chains clanking as the iron portcullis slowly rose. Beyond it, the road was a pristine, untouched blanket of white leading into the dark pines. I stepped through the threshold. The wind immediately bit into my cheeks, biting, violent, and fiercely alive. I didn't look back. The heavy gate slammed shut behind me with a final, echoing thud, sealing the Alpha King in his warm, rotting keep, and leaving me alone in the beautiful, brutal cold. The first mile was fueled entirely by adrenaline and spite. The wind hurled ice crystals against my cheeks, stinging like a spray of gravel, but I barely felt it. I was a coiled spring finally released, moving with a manic, rigid energy. I plunged through snowdrifts that reached my knees, the heavy canvas cloak dragging behind me like a weighted anchor. By the third mile, the spite burned out, leaving nothing but the brutal, suffocating reality of the cold. My leather boots, sturdy enough for the keep's courtyards, were slowly stiffening. The moisture from the snow melted against my body heat, seeping through the seams, freezing my toes into numb, wooden blocks. Every inhalation felt like swallowing crushed glass. The pines around me were ancient and massive, their thick boughs groaning under the weight of accumulated snow. It was a monochromatic world of blinding white and charcoal grey, devoid of any horizon. I stopped beneath a massive spruce, leaning my shoulder against the rough bark. My lungs heaved, expelling plumed clouds of vapor that instantly vanished into the gale. The silence out here was different from the silence in the keep. It wasn't the heavy, watchful quiet of a stone prison. It was a vast, indifferent emptiness. The forest didn't care if I was a fated mate or a rogue. It would freeze me solid by nightfall either way. I needed to shift. Remaining in human form was a death sentence. But shifting without the anchor of a pack was dangerous. The pack bond was a psychological tether. It reminded the wolf that it was part of a hierarchy, a family. It kept the beast from swallowing the human mind entirely. Without it, the line between woman and wild animal blurred. I unclasped my cloak with stiff, fumbling fingers. I stripped off the heavy wool tunics and the leather bodice, my skin breaking out in violent shudders as the sub-zero air hit my bare flesh. I folded the clothes tightly, wrapping them back into the canvas bundle, and shoved it deep into a hollow at the base of the spruce. Then I closed my eyes and let the beast out. The transition was never graceful. It was a violent restructuring of bone and sinew. My spine arched, snapping loudly as the vertebrae elongated. My jaw cracked, pushing forward into a heavy snout, my teeth sharpening into serrated daggers. Coarse, thick grey fur erupted from my skin, insulating me against the biting wind in a matter of seconds. I hit the snow on 4 paws. The world instantly changed. The blinding white dulled into sharp, highly contrasted greys and blues. The air, which had just been freezing and painful, suddenly exploded with information. I smelled the sharp tang of pine resin, the stale musk of a badger sleeping in a burrow 3 miles away, and the faint, coppery scent of a frozen deer carcass buried somewhere to the east. I shook my massive head, my ears flicking back. The wolf in me was confused. She turned in a tight circle, her nose to the wind, searching for the heavy, dominant scent of the alpha. She whined, a low, pathetic sound that vibrated in my chest. She was looking for the golden thread, the pack magic, the familiar scent of iron and pine. He is gone. I pushed the thought down into the primitive brain of the beast. We are alone. The wolf pawed at the snow, agitated. She didn't like it. She wanted the safety of the den. She wanted the hierarchy. But as the wind howled again, fluffing her thick double coat, a new instinct overrode the panic. Hunger. Survival. I broke into a run. The heavy, dragging exhaustion of my human legs vanished. As a wolf, I skimmed over the packed snow, my wide paws acting like snowshoes. The muscles in my hind legs coiled and sprang, propelling me forward with terrifying speed. For 3 days, I lived entirely as the beast. I hunted snow hares, feeling the hot, dark spray of blood against the back of my throat, a stark contrast to the freezing air. I slept in small, dug-out snow caves, curling my tail over my nose to preserve my breath's heat. I didn't think about Kaelin. I didn't think about Beatrice's plum velvet dress. I only thought about the wind, the scent of prey, and the relentless, driving need to put distance between myself and the northern ridge. By the evening of the 3rd day, the terrain began to change. The dense, suffocating pines thinned out, giving way to rolling hills and sparse birch forests. The smell of the air shifted. Beneath the omnipresent scent of ice, I caught the unmistakable odor of wood smoke. Not the clean, singular smoke of a campfire. It was a thick, layered scent. Burnt meat, wet dog, stale ale, and unwashed bodies. A settlement. Neutral territory. I slowed my pace to a cautious trot, my belly brushing the snow. I crested a ridge and looked down into a shallow valley. Nestled against a half-frozen river was a cluster of rough-hewn log buildings. Heavy iron braziers burned at the perimeter, casting dancing orange shadows across the snow. It wasn't a keep. It was a way station, a place for rogues, outcasts, and exiled traders to wait out the brutal winters. I found a thick cluster of boulders a mile from the perimeter. The sun was dipping below the horizon, taking the last of the day's meager heat with it. It was time to become human again. The shift back was always worse. It felt like being crammed into a box that was 2 sizes too small. I collapsed onto the frozen earth, naked and shivering violently, my human skin hypersensitive to the cold after the protection of the fur. I dragged myself to the hollow where I had buried my clothes, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the leather ties. When I was finally dressed, wrapped tightly in my canvas cloak, I leaned against the rock and dry heaved. My human stomach rejected the raw rabbit meat the wolf had gorged on. I spat a mouthful of bitter bile into the snow, wiping my mouth with the back of a filthy, bruised hand. I looked awful. My hair was a tangled, matted mess. There was dried blood beneath my fingernails. My lips were cracked and bleeding. I smiled. It was a sharp, ugly expression that pulled painfully at my split lip. I didn't look like a Luna. I didn't look like a fated mate. I looked like a survivor. I pushed myself off the rock and began the long, staggering walk down toward the smoke. The settlement was called Oak Haven, a deeply ironic name, considering there wasn't an oak tree within 50 miles. It was a miserable, muddy stain on the frozen landscape, comprised of a dozen ramshackle cabins and one large, sprawling tavern built from mismatched timber. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the tavern. The heat hit me like a physical blow. It was dense, suffocating, and smelled fiercely of spilled beer, wet wool, and roasting mutton. The noise was a dull roar of rough voices, clinking clay mugs, and the crackle of a massive hearth fire that dominated the far wall. The moment the door groaned shut behind me, the noise dialed back. 40 pairs of eyes snapped to the entrance. Most of the patrons were humans, rough-looking trappers and merchants, but scattered among them were a dozen wolves. I could see it in the rigid set of their shoulders, the slight dilation of their pupils as they drew in a collective breath. They were tasting the air. They were reading my scent. A wolf without a pack smells different. There's a distinct lack of ozone, an absence of the deep, earthier undertones that pack magic provides. I smelled of the wild. I smelled of raw pine, old blood, and exhaustion. But mostly, I smelled like a rogue. A large man with a heavily scarred jaw sitting near the fire slowly set his mug down. He didn't blink. He was calculating whether I was a threat or prey. I kept my chin level. I didn't project dominance, but I didn't bare my throat in submission either. I simply walked forward, ignoring the stares, my heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. I bypassed the crowded tables and headed straight for the bar. The tavern keeper was a broad-shouldered man with a thick, graying beard and eyes like chipped flint. He wore a stained leather apron and held a rag that had probably never seen a drop of hot water. "Allez," I said, my voice raspy from disuse and the cold, "and whatever meat is currently on the spit." The tavern keeper didn't move. He looked me up and down, taking in the mud on my boots, the exhaustion bruising my eyes, and the complete lack of a pack emblem on my cloak. "Rogues pay up front, girl," he grunted. His voice was a gravelly baritone. "We don't do credit in Oakhaven, especially not for strays." I reached beneath my cloak, my frozen fingers fumbling with the leather pouch tied to my belt. I pulled out a single heavy silver coin. It was unmarked, no royal crest, no pack seal, just pure, forged silver. I dropped it onto the sticky wood of the bar. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. The tavern keeper's eyes flicked to the coin, then back to my face. The hostility dialed back a fraction, replaced by a weary pragmatism. "Name's Tobias," he said, swiping the coin off the wood. He grabbed a clay mug and shoved it under a wooden spigot. "Food's coming. Find a corner. Don't start any fights. If the locals try to test you, take it outside. I don't pay for broken furniture." "Understood," I murmured. I took the mug. The ale was dark, thick, and tasted of burnt malt and dirt. It was the best thing I had ever consumed. It burned a path down my throat, settling in my empty stomach with a heavy, grounding warmth. I found a small table in the darkest corner of the room, far from the hearth. It was freezing back here, the drafts whistling through the poorly chinked logs of the wall, but it offered a clear view of the entire tavern and the exit. A barmaid, a skinny human girl with terrified eyes, practically threw a wooden trencher onto my table a few minutes later. It held a slab of overcooked greasy mutton and a heel of rock-hard bread. I ate it with my hands, tearing the tough meat apart with my teeth, ignoring the grease running down my chin. The wolf inside me practically purred at the influx of hot protein. As I ate, I watched the room. The tension my arrival had caused slowly dissipated. The low roar of conversation resumed. But I could still feel the weight of a few lingering stares. The scarred wolf by the fire was still watching me, his gaze entirely devoid of warmth. This was my new reality. In Kaelin's keep, I had been an inconvenience, a ghost haunting the high table, but I had been fundamentally safe. The pack magic protected me from physical harm, even as the Alpha ignored me. No rogue would dare touch a king's fated, even a rejected one. Here, I was nothing. I was a solitary piece of meat in a room full of hungry scavengers. If I showed weakness, I would be challenged. If I lost, I would be killed, or worse, forced into submission under a lesser wolf. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and took another long swallow of the bitter ale. I didn't feel afraid. The fear had burned out somewhere on the second day in the snow. What replaced it was a cold, hard calcification. The ache in my neck, where the mate mark had once burned like a brand, was completely gone. I brought a hand up, my dirty fingers brushing against the smooth skin. It was just flesh now. No magic. No destiny. I leaned back in the rickety wooden chair, pulling my canvas cloak tighter around my shoulders. I was exhausted, filthy, and entirely alone at the edge of the world. And for the first time in 3 months, I slept without dreaming. Winter broke slowly in the neutral territories. It didn't happen with a sudden burst of sunlight and blooming flowers. It happened with mud. The pristine white snowbanks turned into grey, slushy slop. The frozen river cracked and groaned, flooding the lower banks of Oakhaven with freezing, muddy water. I stayed. I didn't move on to the coast as I had vaguely planned. The tavern became my anchor. I earned my keep not with silver, that ran out after the first 2 weeks, but with sweat. Tobias, it turned out, was perpetually short-handed. Men who drifted to Oakhaven rarely wanted to work. I chopped wood out back, swinging a heavy iron axe until my palms were entirely covered in thick, yellowish calluses. I hauled water from the river. I scrubbed the floors after the nightly brawls, washing away spilled ale, vomit, and blood with a bucket of lye and a coarse brush. It was grueling, mindless labor. It was exactly what I needed. The physical exhaustion silenced the lingering whispers of the wolf inside me. The beast stopped looking for a pack. She accepted the rhythm of the axe, the weight of the water buckets, and the warmth of the hearth fire. She accepted that I was the alpha of our own small, solitary existence. The locals stopped staring. They learned quickly that the quiet, grey-eyed woman hauling firewood wasn't looking for a mate, wasn't looking for a fight, and didn't back down when pushed. One evening, a drunken trapper grabbed my arm as I carried a tray of empty mugs past his table. He smelled of cheap gin and unwashed skin. "You're a pretty little stray, ain't you?" he slurred, his fingers digging into my bicep. I didn't shout. I didn't try to pull away. I simply turned my head, looking down at his hand, and let my eyes flash a brilliant, predatory gold. A low growl, entirely inhuman and vibrating with lethal intent, tore from my throat. The man dropped my arm as if he had grabbed a hot coal, scrambling backward over his chair. I didn't say a word. I just adjusted the tray and walked back to the bar. Tobias nodded approvingly from behind the spigot. After that, I was entirely invisible in the best way possible. The news from the north arrived with the first of the spring merchant caravans. It was late afternoon. I was sitting on the wooden porch of the tavern, a piece of coarse sandpaper in my hand, smoothing out the handle of a new axe. The air was damp and smelled of turning earth. A convoy of heavily laden wagons rolled into the muddy center of Oakhaven. The merchants looked exhausted, their horses lathered and thin. They brought trade goods, spices, salt, bolts of cheap linen, but they also brought stories. I sat quietly, the sandpaper rhythmically rasping against the wood, as a merchant with a thick southern accent recounted the gossip over a mug of hot cider to Tobias. "The northern ridge is bleeding," the merchant said, shaking his head. "Pack's in shambles." My hand paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed its steady, back-and-forth motion. Scrape, scrape, scrape. "Winter sickness?" Tobias asked, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Worse." "Madness," the merchant replied. The Alpha King, Kylan. Word is, he broke a fated bond, tossed the goddess's magic right out the window for some southern noblewoman. Tobias snorted, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the mud. Fool. Aye, the wolf in him didn't take it well. They say he went feral for a week, barely recognizable. The western packs caught wind of the weakness and breached the Red River border. I stopped sanding. I didn't look up, but I listened with a strange, detached curiosity. It felt like hearing a story about strangers. Did the keep fall? Tobias asked. No, the merchant sighed. Kylan pulled himself together enough to lead the defense, ripped the throat out of the Western Alpha himself. But it was a bloodbath. He lost half his border guard. His beta, a big scarred bastard named Auric, took a spear through the thigh. He'll walk with a limp for the rest of his life. A brief, sharp pang hit my chest. Auric. He had been the only one in that stone prison who had treated me like a person. I pushed the regret down. It wasn't my war. And the noblewoman? Tobias pressed, always hungry for the dramatic details. Fled. The merchant laughed harshly. Soon as the first howl sounded on the border, she packed her velvet dresses and took a carriage straight back south. Left the king staring at the snow. They say he sits in the great hall now, alone, drinking himself blind. Pack morale is in the dirt. He kept his crown, but he lost his soul. The merchant finished his cider and wandered off toward the stables. Tobias stood in the doorway for a long moment. He slowly turned his head, looking down at me, sitting on the steps. He didn't know my past. I had never told him my name, and I had certainly never mentioned the Northern Ridge. But Tobias was a man who survived by reading the unsaid things. He looked at my rough, calloused hands, the faded canvas cloak, and the smooth, unblemished skin on the left side of my neck. He didn't ask. He just gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. Would need stacking before nightfall, he grunted, turning back into the tavern. I'll get to it, I replied, my voice steady. I stood up, brushing the sawdust from my leather breeches. I walked to the water trough at the edge of the porch to wash my hands. The ice had finally melted entirely, leaving the water clear and still. I leaned over, splashing the freezing water onto my face, scrubbing away the dust and sweat. As the ripples settled, my reflection stared back at me. My face was leaner than it had been 3 months ago. The soft, rounded cheeks of the girl who had arrived at Kylan's keep were gone, replaced by sharp cheekbones and a hard, unyielding jawline. My eyes weren't the wide, hopeful eyes of a fated mate. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a wolf who knew exactly what she was worth. I turned my head slightly, exposing my neck to the dim afternoon light, where the mate mark had once burned, where the thick grey scab had finally peeled away and fallen onto the dirt floor of an armory. There was a faint change in the texture of the skin. It wasn't a magical symbol anymore. It was just a scar, a patch of slightly paler skin, fully healed, smooth to the touch. It didn't itch. It didn't burn. It didn't ache. Kylan was sitting in a ruined hall, drowning in ale and the suffocating guilt of a broken kingdom. He had chosen his comfort, and it had destroyed him. I had chosen the cold. I had walked into the freezing unknown, carrying nothing but a knife and the absolute certainty that I belonged to myself. I grabbed the heavy iron axe from the porch. The wooden handle felt perfectly balanced in my calloused grip. The weight of it was grounding, real. I turned my back on the muddy road that led north, walked toward the woodpile, and raised the axe. The scars we carry aren't always a reminder of what we lost. Sometimes they are the proof of what we survived. Maeve walked away from a broken bond and forged her own destiny in the ice. The Alpha King learned too late that fate doesn't forgive arrogance. Thank you for joining me on this journey of raw survival and quiet vengeance. If you loved this deeply grounded, gritty take on werewolf lore, smash that like button, share this story with your pack, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dark fantasy tales. Leave a comment below. Did Kalen get what he deserved? See you in the next one.